Hey everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Meryl Richards and I'm the moderator for today's webinar on food companies' progress in disclosing emissions and setting targets. I'm a director of research on the Food and Forest team here at Ceres. Ceres is this nonprofit organization working with the most influential capital market leaders to solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. Just a couple notes on logistics before we begin today's session. This session is being recorded, so we'll be sending all participants a link to the recording after the webinar. If you have colleagues who weren't able to join, please feel free to share that with them as well. If you have a technical question like trouble with audio, please type that into the Q&A box and we'll try to help you sort it out, but hopefully that will not happen. Next slide. I want to thank each of you for participating in this event today, and I'm especially grateful to our speakers. We've got a great lineup. Nako Kobayashi is a manager on the Food and Forest team here at Ceres. She develops thought leadership on climate transition plans for the food sector and manages the Food Emissions 50 benchmark, which we'll be hearing about today. She most recently argued our investor guide to climate transition plans for the US food sector. She holds an MS in Agriculture, Food, and Environment from Tufts. Natalie Wasek graduated magna cum laude from St. Bonaventure University with a BBA in accounting and minors in international business and theology. Natalie joined Seventh Generation Interfaith in 2019 after a year of volunteer service with Franciscan Volunteers, No Risk, No Gain, and the Sisters of St. Francis of Philadelphia, which was framed around ecological and social justice. Her current work at SBTi focuses on food, water, and environmental issues. So thank you for joining us, Natalie. Also joining us is Stephanie Baema, who's Manager of Investor Engagement on the Ceres Food and Forest team, and she'll be moderating our discussion today. This webinar is part, if you're joining, you probably know this, but is part of Ceres Food Emission 50 initiative, which is an investor-led initiative to accelerate progress on climate change in the food sector. We engage 50 of the highest emitting public food companies in North America. Investors are seeking to move companies to improve their greenhouse gas emission disclosures, set ambitious reduction targets, and implement ambitious climate transition plans in line with the Paris Agreement. One component of this initiative is a public benchmark of company performance on emission disclosures, targets, and transition plans eventually. We launched this initiative in July of 2021, and since then we've seen some really considerable progress among the 50 companies that are involved. So Nako's going to start us off today by reviewing how companies have improved performance in the benchmark since we launched over a year ago. Then Stephanie and Natalie will join us for a discussion. Seventh Generation is a signatory of Food Emissions 50, and Natalie will discuss some insights from their recent engagements with food companies. Finally, Naka will rejoin us for a quick explainer of what investors need to know about new guidance on land-based emissions from the Science Based Targets Initiative and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Before we get started, I would also like to note that an integral part of our discussion today is the role that natural and working lands play in mitigating climate change. And I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Native and Indigenous people here in the US and also globally, depending on where you're joining from, who have stewarded these lands for generations with attention to both people and the environment. Especially here in the US, it's been Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday. We do this to affirm our commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people around the world, including in our own work. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nako. Nako, take it away.
Thanks, Meryl. Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks everyone for being with us today. So if you could go to the next slide. Meryl did a great job introducing Food Emissions 50, so I'll skip most of this, but do want to mention that our benchmark and the initiative itself does focus a lot on Scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services, which tends to be the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions for companies in the food sector. And so if you could go to the next slide. Our benchmark and the initiative itself covers, as Meryl said, 50 of the largest publicly listed companies with greenhouse gas emissions, and it covers the 6 different GICS, or Global Industry Classification Standard, sub-industries that you see here on this slide. And the companies cover various parts of the food supply chains, from the agricultural products companies, otherwise known as commodity traders, all the way down to the retailers and restaurants. So really covering that span of the value chain and the different leverage points within the supply chains to better align with the 1.5 degree future. I do want to make a quick note that for those of you who have been following our initiative since we launched, you may notice a slight difference in our list. And so I wanted to mention that we did take off George Weston recently from the Food Emissions 50 list after they sold off much of their bakery and other food businesses. And we also took off Sanderson Farms due to them no longer being a publicly listed company. And we have replaced those companies with Maple Leaf Foods, which is a Canadian packaged meats company, and also Papa John's International, which is an international pizza chain. So with that, if we could go up 2 slides. And the next one, yeah, I can just go right into the progress that we've seen over the course of the past several months. So as Meryl mentioned, we launched Food Emissions 50 in July of 2021. And since then, we have seen a lot of company movement that we're excited to share. Over the course of this time, 25 different companies have taken 48 different actions to improve their disclosures and targets. The Food Emissions 50 benchmark currently benchmarks companies on 2 different indicators. The first indicator we benchmark on is emissions disclosure. And specifically, we are looking at scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services and whether companies disclose those emissions. And then within that disclosure, we look for clarification and explanation and just clarity that that emissions estimate includes emissions from agriculture and emissions from land use change. On the target side, we are looking for targets that cover scope 3 emissions. So targets that only cover scope 1 and 2 would not be counted for. And we are also looking at companies that within those companies, those that have targets that are validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative. So as you can see over the span of this initiative, we've seen 10 additional companies disclosing their scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services. And we've seen 15 additional companies setting any target that includes scope 3. So we've definitely seen more progress on the front of companies setting targets, but that's also because there are more companies that were already disclosing their scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services. With the addition of 10 new companies that are disclosing those emissions, you can see that well over half of our focus companies have disclosed their scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services. And I think, we've heard a lot of potential, questions about how difficult it is for companies to, account for and disclose these emissions. But you can see that a majority of the companies that we're tracking do already know what their emissions look like and have disclosed them. And so it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect their other 20 companies on our list to follow suit. And so with that, I will jump into kind of the deeper dive into the results that we've seen since the last time we updated our benchmark, which was in January. So since January, we've seen a decent number of companies move in terms of emissions disclosures. Specifically, 6 additional companies have disclosed their scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services, though I will say one of those companies was Maple Leaf Foods, which is a new addition, and they had already disclosed those emissions. So it's really 5 that had already been on our benchmark that made progress on this front since January through September of this year. And those companies are Beyond Meat, Chipotle, Hormel, Post Holding, and Wendy's. So a lot of companies with exposure to meat-related and livestock-related greenhouse gas emissions are disclosing their emissions from purchased goods and services for the first time, which is definitely exciting to see. And then on the right-hand side of this table, you'll see that there are 3 additional companies that have improved their disclosures. So these are companies that have either made it clear in their emissions disclosure that agriculture and or land use change emissions are included in their estimates. And we do look for this separately from just whether companies are disclosing purchased goods and services emissions, because oftentimes if companies are not explicitly stating that these emissions are being included, they may be omitted. And this may be not a deliberate choice, but just that the companies may not know enough about the data that they're using to make sure that these emissions are being included. And omission of these emissions can lead to vast underreporting of companies' Scope 3 emissions, just because these emissions tend to make up the majority of Scope 3 emissions for companies in this sector. And if you can go to the next slide. On the target side, we've definitely seen a lot of movement here as well. We've seen since we updated the benchmark in January, 15 additional companies have set, or maybe that's not the number since the last time, but we've seen a lot of more movements of the companies you see here on the screen. Albertsons, Campbell, McCormick, Cisco, and UNFI are all companies, so 5 of them that have set science-based targets, initiative validated targets for the first time since January. And what I do want to emphasize is you see a longer list of companies here on the right. And these are companies that have not yet had their targets validated, but they have some committed to setting science-based targets to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So once companies do so, they have a set period of time before they're required by the initiative to submit those targets. So we should be seeing Science-Based Targets Initiative validated targets coming from the companies you see here on the right-hand side in the near future. And this is all really exciting movement to see. And at the end of the session today, as Meryl mentioned, I'll be coming back on to talk a little bit about the greenhouse protocol guidance on land sector and removals, as well as the Science-Based Targets Initiative forest, land, and agriculture guidance that was recently launched. And these are both tools that will help really make sure that greenhouse gas emissions targets are including land-based emissions, which is really critical in order for us to align with a 1.5 degree pathway. And if you can go to the next slide, I do want to mention that there are 10 companies on our benchmark and focus list that have yet to disclose any supply chain emissions or set targets to reduce them. And so you can see the list of companies here on the left-hand side of this slide. And this is really critical. Scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services typically make up the vast majority of these companies' emissions. And so it is definitely important for companies to better understand where their emissions are actually coming from, to be able to account for and disclose those emissions, as well as for investors to really understand a company's full emissions footprint and the different climate risks they may be exposed to. Additionally, gaining better visibility into supply chains and the emissions that are coming from supply chains can help companies mitigate future business vulnerabilities and ensure the long-term stability of their supply chains. And really, without understanding the full extent of Scope 3 emissions, it's really difficult for companies to understand the leverage points that are available to them to address these. And more we're seeing with the SEC draft rule and other market pressures, there is going to be an increased focus on Scope 3 emissions, and the expectation will be that companies will know what their Scope 3 emissions look like, and so it's really critical. I will also note that there are some companies that have set greenhouse gas emissions targets, but have not yet disclosed their greenhouse gas emissions. And those companies would have had to set, account for and create a baseline greenhouse gas inventory in order to set a target. So they likely have that information available to them, but for one reason or another have yet to disclose those emissions. And so it will be really critical to make sure that those companies, especially if they have already done that work to account for their emissions, are disclosing them like their peers. And so if you can go to the next slide. So as you can see, and as I've mentioned, we've seen a lot of great company movement, and more companies now have greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets. This is really great progress to see, but now that these companies have targets, investors are looking for evidence that companies know what they need to do in order to achieve those targets. So it's really great that companies have commitments, but now a lot of stakeholders, including investors, are seeking climate transition plans that outline how companies intend to achieve those targets, both in the short term and in the long term on their journey to net zero. And so in May of this year, we published a report called the Investor Guide to Climate Transition Plans in the US Food Sector. And the report really outlines a lot of different things that investors can take stock of as they assess corporate disclosures, and we identified some key areas that should appear within climate transition plans in this sector. In the report, we identified 4 key areas in particular within a company's business that should be covered by a climate transition plan. This includes growth and innovation strategy, so the forward-looking strategy of a company and how they are planning to grow their business and whether or not they're preemptively including climate-related considerations as a part of that process in their strategic thinking. And corporate procurement strategies and supply chain. So a vast majority of the emissions in this sector comes from the supply chain and the ingredients food companies are purchasing. And so it's really key that corporate procurement strategies are well aligned with companies' greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets. Clearly, operations, waste, and transportation also is a key area for addressing scope 1 and 2 emissions, though these are smaller proportions of emissions in the sector, still very important to mitigate in order to align fully with the 1.5 degree scenario. And then finally, customer engagement is a critical piece in the sector, just because of the influence on what consumers are eating and the climate impacts of that. And so how are companies sort of innovating their products and services to better engage their customers on their choices that may lead to a lower emissions footprint for the company overall. And so as a follow-up to this report, just in the past couple of weeks, we released a new brief, and the brief includes a lot of different examples of how companies are taking actions to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in line with the recommendations of the investor guide. So in the next few slides, I'll talk a little bit about that, but I do want to note that in doing so, we're not able to present a complete example of a company with a climate transition plan, right? A lot of companies are still in the beginning stages of this, and different companies are doing different pieces of what they should be doing. But it's really important to note that there are companies taking really innovative and interesting actions, and there are still gaps to fill in terms of making sure those disclosures are comprehensive and clear, and clearly chart the path that a company will take to achieve their targets. So with that, we'll move quickly to the next slide. And so I just want to highlight a couple of examples from the brief, but please feel free to browse the brief yourself. The links will be in the chat to get a little bit more context and get examples for all the different areas. But I'm just going to talk about the growth strategy example and a procurement example for today. So on growth strategy, it's really critical that companies are integrating climate-related considerations into their growth strategy. And so what this could look like is often companies will start with an acknowledgement. So companies will acknowledge that climate influences their business. So as an example here, I've pulled an example from Conagra, which is a company on our list, and they disclose that they're responding to increased consumer interest in sustainable diets. So that could be a potential market risk or a reputation risk if they're not offering things that maybe their competitors are, that their customers are demanding. And they are responding to this by expanding their product lines and innovation in plant-based and meat alternative options. So with this acknowledgement, they have then led to product development where they have acquired new plant-based brands, and they've also launched their own new products that offer more plant-based protein alternatives to their existing products. So Conagra has a suite of products, and they've recently launched plant-based versions of those while still having those existing versions of those products in their portfolio. To take it a step further, what would make for a good climate transition fund disclosure would be an explanation of how this is going to be integrated into the business as a whole. So in most cases, new products alone will not align a company with a 1.5 degree scenario. And so companies will need to transform their existing products by looking at ways to reduce the emissions impact of not just their new products, but of their existing products and services, and explain how climate related considerations are not being just applied to new acquisitions or new products, but how they're being integrated to the business as a whole, as a part of what a company is planning to do in the next several years to grow their business. And in the next slide, I have an example here about procurement. So I said supply chains are the source of the vast majority of emissions in this sector. And the first step a company could take is to engage suppliers to set targets. So for companies that may have that may have limited traceability in their supply chains. They're just starting out on their journey. A great first step is to just set a requirement for their suppliers to set greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets and to disclose on those targets, just as McDonald's has done. And then a next step would be to really break down not just which emissions are scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services, but within that, getting a sense of where those emissions are coming from. So as an example, General Mills did this kind of assessment and found that 54% of their emissions footprint comes from agriculture specifically. So within purchased goods and services, the vast majority of their emissions were coming from agriculture. And so to respond to this, they set a goal to advance regenerative agriculture on 1 million acres of farmland by 2030, which represents 25 to 35% of their global sourcing footprint. So they looked at the breakdown of their emissions, and then they were able to create a strategy that addresses those emissions very specifically. An additional piece of information that could be helpful here is knowing, what the company's plans are to scale up that initiative to cover a larger percentage of their supply chain. And so with that, you can go on to the next slide. I think some of the key takeaways here are that there are a lot of companies that are increasingly aware of climate as a financial risk. And there is a lot of discussion on how companies are starting to address climate change. And there's evidence that these actions are being taken across different business sections and functions. So it's across different procurement functions and operations, but also different functions within the company, such as R&D and CapEx. We do see a lot of different actions. However, the disclosures remain mostly qualitative, and they're often limited to pilots or specific brands or products, and often consist of a limited portion of the company's supply chain or business. And supplier engagement definitely seems to be remaining as a challenge. And the current state of disclosures overall still is painting a murky picture of companies' strategic plans to achieve their targets and whether they're acting quickly enough. So we think that really the next steps are for companies to start quantifying some parts of their plans to give investors a sense of, okay, this is great that you're doing all these different actions, but how are all these actions going to add up to really result in the emissions reductions that you've promised you'll reduce through your greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets? And so with that, you can go to the next slide, and I will hand it back to Meryl.
Thanks so much, Nako. If you're joining from an investor or a company, I'd really encourage you to check out, or anyone really, I'd really encourage you to check out the resource that Nako mentioned. The link is in the chat of the Zoom. We'll now transition to a discussion with Stephanie and Natalie. As I mentioned, Stephanie is a manager of investor engagement on the Food and Forest team here at Ceres, and Natalie is a shareholder advocacy manager at 7th Generation Interfaith Coalition for Responsible Investment, or SGI for short. So take it away, Stephanie and Natalie. Anxious to hear what Natalie has to say.
Thanks, Meryl. Hi, everybody. Stephanie Bema from the Food and Forest team, and it is my pleasure today to have a bit of a Q&A with one of our investors, Natalie Wasek from 7th Generation. Hi, Natalie.
Hi, Stephanie. Thanks for talking to me and having me on today.
Thank you. Well, I know because I've supported a number of your engagements, the amount of impact that you guys have. So I'm thrilled to get to ask you some questions about it today. And why don't we start at the beginning? 7th Gen has been engaging companies for several years now. Where did you begin with your company engagements, and how have your priorities related to food and ag and climate evolved?
Sure. I think just to give brief background on SGI, we're a coalition of about 35 institutional members. Many of them are faith-based, but other are values-based asset managers and owners as well. And so our members are the ones that set our priorities for our engagements. But within that environment has always been one of the key focuses and key priorities for our members. We started engaging food companies, restaurants, retailers, and so forth on palm oil years ago. With those engagements that developed more into deforestation commitments from companies to cross-commodity deforestation commitments, now into scope 3 emissions, climate change, and transition plans. So it really evolved from just a one focus on palm oil and the impacts of palm oil to the broader impacts of land use change on climate emissions.
Awesome, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. All of our awarenesses have certainly expanded in these years. Maybe I can ask you, does your approach to engaging food companies differ from your approach to engaging companies in other sectors?
It does, but it does because I think the companies and the makeups of emissions across sectors changes. So within the food sector and these food companies, scope 3 emissions make up about sometimes 90, close to 99% of climate emissions, all of greenhouse gas emissions for the companies compared to other sectors like the oil and gas or utilities or the tech sectors. So the makeup of emissions for the companies is much different. And with scope 3 being the majority, if not nearly all of the greenhouse gas emissions, the focus is a little bit different. And so we do have to focus on more of the purchased goods and services and how to work with the companies on their supply chain and land use. Because while emissions make up, or the scope 3 emissions make up close to all of the emissions within scope 3, land use change and deforestation probably accounts for over 2/3 of those emissions. So the focus is really different. So the engagements have to reflect those differences.
That makes sense. Now, if we could talk a little bit more about some of those engagements. 7th Gen signed on to the FE50 right when we launched it at the end of the summer, beginning of last fall. And I know you've been engaged in a number of dialogues and beyond, and several of those examples that Nako had up on one of her slides of company movements. I recognize those as engagements that you guys were involved in. So I wonder if you could speak to any themes that have come up in your FE50 engagements.
Sure. Starting first is I think some companies that we work with have already set some science-based targets. So they've either had well below 1.5 well below 2 degrees or 1.5 within the Science-Based Target Initiative. So one of the themes in those conversations is either increasing or improving those already established science-based targets and pushing them to net zero. And now with the new flag guidance, introducing them to the flag and improving those disclosures and those goals within the Science-Based Target Initiative. Another theme that has come up a lot is the mapping of scope 3. It's improved a lot since even the start of any deforestation conversations and emissions conversations. Companies are beginning to understand the importance of scope 3. They're realizing that scope 3 emissions are the bulk of their greenhouse gas emissions, and that they're not going to reach their climate goals without looking at their scope 3 emissions. So within the setting of targets and mapping of scope 3, that's definitely been a larger theme coming out of the conversations that we're having with these companies. And I think another theme has been the setting of targets in general. So a lot of companies have had either scope 1 and 2 emissions targets and are now just entering scope 3 targets. And within that, we've been working with a lot of fast food companies or franchisees. And so one of the themes there is they're setting scope 3 targets and beginning to understand how to set scope 3 targets without full understanding necessarily of how they're going to achieve them within their franchisees, because the structure is different than just a retailer and their supply chain. So it does get a little bit more complicated with what's considered a scope 3 emission, what's considered from suppliers and so forth. One other theme has been some of the pushback on scope 3 emissions and what's included and the difficulty in mapping and setting targets for scope 3. I think a lot of it is still unknown to food companies because the supply chain is very difficult to understand, and it's very diverse because you're looking at different commodities, you're looking at different regions, different areas. So the mapping of the supply chain is difficult, but there's definitely been movement on understanding certain commodities, certain supply chains, and how to map. And even within mapping, how to set targets. That's been a big theme there. And I guess one other theme is the work in mapping, the work with third-party consultants and other outside organizations in order to map. There's been, I think it differs across whatever consultants some companies are using. We've worked with one company who has used a third-party consultant to set their science-based targets and to map their scope 3. And within that, we learned that this consultant didn't consider land use change as a part of their scope 3 emissions because it was so far removed from the company's main operations, and as well as it didn't fit into the cost curve analysis of what they were planning for their climate targets. So it differs across company, across supply chain, across commodity.
Yeah, good thing somebody was asking those questions to bring up that it may be relevant in this case. Shows the influence of these engagements, certainly. One more question around scope 3, and thanks for speaking to it because it is certainly all the chatter. I know it can be difficult for some companies who have a very complicated supply chain, but we also have other companies on the FE50 benchmark that have a less complicated supply chain. They might be like a pure play dairy company, or they just don't have as much sourcing issues. Do you sometimes have to tease out what you consider more legitimate pushback from maybe less legitimate pushback, and just a little bit about how you might approach that?
Sure. I think that there is, like I said, there is pushback, and to mitigate that pushback or work with the companies on it, we can also look at the leaders in the sector and on these missions. So there are companies that do have mapping of their scope 3 and their supply chain, and they're trying to understand and learn more about their supply chain. And so looking at the best practices and knowing that there are companies that are doing this work, or at least trying to do more to understand their supply chains and the mapping. And so it's using those leaders to push the laggards and push back against the pushback, really, to work with them to improve it. And I think that also goes along with encouraging collaboration across the sector, across these companies, in terms of roundtables or sharing best practices within each company and across the companies and sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. Role models are important in many places. And yeah, some of these companies are parts of roundtables and membership organizations, and they can say both maybe helpful and less helpful things in those organizations, but when they are acting as a role model, that can be very helpful to pushing groups of companies along. Mm-hmm. You mentioned talking about leaders who are doing good mapping and making good efforts. Maybe we could talk about a little bit about how you see companies approaching agricultural emissions reductions and some of their strategies there.
Sure. I think with that, and I think Nako touched on it earlier, is a lot of what companies are trying to do and fit into their climate goals and scope 3 and sustainable agriculture are a lot of pilots and exploration in these different projects. And so I think we've seen with companies that they have set scope 3 targets and they're working on figuring out how to achieve them within purchased goods. So whether it's in their beef supply chain or their palm oil or soy sourcing and growth there, is that they are pilots and they're these beginning programs, but it's then how do you expand them to increase other sustainable agriculture across the supply chain and introduce what learned key things for, say, beef. How does that fit into the soy supply chain and across the rest of the company? So I think that we're beginning to see some movement in sustainable agriculture. But then it's how do you learn and expand that into the rest of your scope 3 goals and land use change goals and emissions.
Right, like walk, crawl, run, sure, but
right.
Tell me how you're thinking about doing that. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, maybe we could hear about an FE50 engagement that maybe began as a dialogue, ended up that you were filing, and maybe then you ended up in a negotiation and you were able to withdraw it or not withdraw it. maybe talk to us about one of those that kind of had a whole life cycle of the engagement.
Sure. So we began engaging Post Holdings within the Food Emissions 50. Post is an interesting company compared to some of the others that we've worked with, given that they are a holdings company. So it's not just one company, one set of emissions, one supply chain, given the structure of the company. So it's a bit different structure in terms of how we would engage them and focus on goals. But they made great progress from where we started. So when we first started engaging Post, they had one ESG report that I believe came out in 2020. So there wasn't much disclosure or transparency on their deforestation, scope 3, or any climate goals or climate transition plans. So it was really starting from the beginning in our mind of where the company was at and where they could go compared to some of their peers. And I say peers, but like I said, because the structure is different, it was difficult a little bit to explain the connection there. We did end up filing a resolution with the company asking for a report on if and how they could increase the scale, pace, and rigor on their efforts to reduce their total contribution to climate change, covering both their company operations and supply chain, so including all scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. In talking to the company after we filed the resolution, we did end up withdrawing the resolution with the company's announcement of climate goals across their companies, including a scope 1 and 2 emissions reduction by 2030. They are developing a scope 3 emission target that they will hopefully have done by the end of 2022, as well as a no deforestation policy that is already up, and among other environment goals across water, sustainable packaging, and other goals. So to go from kind of the lack of disclosure and transparency to seeing that they were working on this kind of in the background of what was being disclosed to the public was great to see. And it's great to see the movement that they're making now, and hopefully will continue to make with the scope 3 target, with this deforestation policy, and how they continue to work with their supply chain and work on achieving these goals.
That's a great example. Thank you. And I know that it's important to 7th Gen to, keep the dialogue going and maintain a good relationship where you can get updates and continue to encourage them and stay apprised of progress. And I think that really shows, in these dialogues that maybe you went to a filing, but it's not a relationship breaker. So right. That's a great example. Thanks. All right. As we near the end, the topic of climate transition plans, we've got to touch on that because that's how we're expanding the FE50 benchmark next year. Everybody's thinking about what should be in one. We don't have any perfect examples, but there are some pieces. But it brings us back to the question of why are we talking about them in the first place? What is lacking in current disclosures that makes investors think that something like a climate transition plan would be something that they would want?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back on all of these companies who set targets and goals for ending deforestation by 2020, 2020 came and passed without movement towards these no deforestation targets, and without any acknowledgement of that, really. And so if you look at a timeline, it's 2022 now, 2030 is essentially tomorrow in these companies' eyes. And we don't want to come to 2030 with the same kind of bypassing like we did 2020 in these deforestation targets that these companies set. So I think climate transition plans are important we're setting scope 1, 2, and 3 targets and goals. We're setting these climate goals, but how are you going to achieve them by the timeline? I think with the 2020 deforestation goals, some companies realize that maybe they shouldn't be setting these broad targets if they don't know how they're going to reach them. But I think encouraging companies to continue to set these goals is important, but looking into how they're going to achieve them. A lot of them are already working on scope 1 and 2. So explaining how they're reaching their scope 1 and 2 goals, and then explaining how they can start working on their scope 3 goals, what their like we talked about mapping, we talked about pilot projects and different technologies that are increasing in terms of mapping and improving sustainable agriculture and understanding of land use change. So the transition plans are important for both investors and companies to understand how they're going to reach these goals. Because I think if they don't have these transition plans and they don't have an understanding, it might be another 2020 deforestation. And so it's good to have that understanding of what the action's going to be. But I think it goes along with setting targets. So it's setting the targets and how are you going to achieve them? And you don't have to know every single thing. I think that's the one thing with asking companies about transition plans is I don't know if they're thinking that we're asking them to know every single detail of how they're going to reach the goals. But as technologies improve, as they get a better understanding, to continue to incorporate that into their targets and in their goal setting.
Right. Yeah. Nobody's looking for a surprise when we get to 2030. I think we can all agree 2020 was a crappy year in many ways. Let's not repeat that. Show us the breadcrumbs. If you want to call it a climate transition plan or something else, just lay out the breadcrumbs so investors can get an idea of whether to believe the company or not. Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you. That was a lot of great information. Very helpful, I'm sure. And with that, we will hand it back over.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie and Natalie. Really great to hear the progress that you're seeing and what you're going to be looking for from companies next. A recurrent theme in this discussion and also in some of the Q&A questions that we're getting is, how companies are measuring these emissions, what are some of the issues, how are they setting targets, some questions about carbon removals and flags. So we've got a few minutes for Nako to give us a rundown of the forthcoming Science-Based Targets Initiative flag guidance and the land emissions and removals guidance from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So go ahead, Nako.
Great, thanks, Meryl. And yeah, that was a really interesting discussion. So thank you so much, Stephanie and Natalie. If you could go to the next slide. Going back to what I mentioned a little bit earlier in this session, we do see that more companies are disclosing their emissions from purchased goods and services, yet we see little evidence of companies really making it clear that their emissions estimates include emissions from land use change and agriculture. And this is, likely due to the fact that companies may not know whether these emissions are being included. There may not have been clarity. So although many companies have done so, many other companies have not yet disclosed this kind of information. And if these emissions are not being included in the baseline or annual, greenhouse gas emissions inventories that are being reported on, then we can be pretty sure that those emissions are also being omitted from greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets. And so if companies are not setting targets to reduce these emissions, then it creates a lot of liabilities in this sector for a lot of unaddressed emissions that need to be addressed in order to meet a 1.5 degree pathway. So if you go on to the next slide, we're really happy to be able to share the work of other partners and other organizations that have been working very hard to provide tools for companies to make this a little bit clearer of a process. And so very recently, last month, the Science-Based Targets Initiative released their long-awaited forest, land, and agriculture guidance for setting science-based targets. And in parallel, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has also been working with that team and on their own to develop their new land sector and removals guidance, which will provide guidance on how companies can account for and report their greenhouse gas emissions from the land sector, so land use change and agriculture, as well as from removals, which I know we had a couple questions about in the chat. And so in the next few slides, I'd like to dive into a little bit of what this means for companies. Won't be diving too much into the details of these guidance, but we definitely encourage you all to go to the flag guidance website on the SBTi website, as well as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance. So if you can go to the next slide. really what's new about both of these guidances, if you will, are that historically greenhouse gas inventories, like I said, have not comprehensively covered these emissions. And so a lot of these emissions were not being accounted for, both in inventories and in targets. And land-based emissions are really critical to reduce to align with 1.5 degrees. And this new guidance will just clarify many of the key issues that leading companies that have been tackling this on their own have been addressing, and create a standardized way for companies to calculate, report, and set targets to reduce their land-based greenhouse gas emissions. And if you can go to the next slide. So starting with the flag guidance from the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So companies have been using the Science-Based Targets Initiative for several years to set credible science-based emissions reductions targets that are aligned with certain temperature paths. However, in the past, land-based emissions, have not been very strictly monitored. And so if companies weren't accounting for those emissions within their accounting, they might not have been accounted for in these targets, especially in the scope 3 aspect. Those targets were not initially historically temperature aligned. And so what this guidance will do is create a way for companies to set their traditional greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets for their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and also their non-land scope 3 emissions, but they would add a flag target for the land-based emissions. And so the guidance points out a few different thresholds for companies that will be required to set this target, depending on how much of the land-based emissions comprise their emissions inventory. And so companies will be adding on a separate commitment to reduce scope 3 flag emissions, for example, if it is scope 3 by X% by X year compared to a baseline year. And what's also very new about this guidance is that the Science-Based Targets Initiative is now requiring companies, along with this flag target, to disclose an additional target or commitment to no deforestation across primary deforestation linked commodities with a target date of no later than the end of 2025. And so this really clearly lays out that without addressing deforestation, companies will not be able to achieve their greenhouse gas emissions reductions target. So this is an explicit ask for companies to have a clear commitment to eliminate deforestation from their supply chain. Though this language is specific to deforestation, it is really important to note that in order to set a flag target, companies enter their data into the pathway tool that the SBTi provides, and that tool into this pathway for flag emissions has already baked in considerations for other conversion of land. And so in order to have a validated target that meets those thresholds in the tool, it's an expectation that conversion of all ecosystems is also addressed. And if you go on to the next slide, the greenhouse gas protocol guidance is sort of in lockstep with the flag target setting guidance. And so in order to set a flag target, companies will need to take stock of all of their land-based emissions, and the tools that they'll use to do so will be provided by the greenhouse gas protocol. So it's really important to note that a lot of guidance has already existed from Qantas and others to account for land-based emissions, but this new guidance just provides more clarity and consistency and just cohesion among the different ways companies are doing this. And then the novel piece of it is also their guidance on removals. And so this guidance provides a clear set of requirements and clarity on the boundaries. And what's also interesting about this guidance that it does provide ways for companies to estimate their land-based emissions at varying degrees of traceability. So we do encourage companies to increase the traceability in their supply chains to get a better sense of where their commodities are coming from, and really the real on the ground exposure to things like deforestation. However, for companies that do not have a high level of traceability in their supply chain yet, the guidance also provides robust tools and information on how companies can use statistical land use change emissions estimates to get a sense of what their emissions footprint looks like. And the guidance also comes with a really handy Excel download that lists all the different land sector calculations resources that are out there and maps out kind of vaguely which of those resources are more or less likely to include the different types of emissions that companies need to be accounting for. So if a company lists, oh, we use this, tool to calculate our emissions, you might be able to find that listed in this information, and you can see, oh, like if they use this one, we can be more confident that deforestation emissions are likely to be included in that tool. But the guidance also provides a lot of information for companies that will equip them with the right questions to ask of the data that they're being provided with, to make sure that they're all kind of aligning with the greenhouse gas protocol's guidance. And to quickly touch on how this guidance changes expectations, really, it's that now companies will really have the methods available to them to calculate their land-based emissions, whether or not they have a lot of traceability in the supply chain or less traceability, and they'll be able to use that to refine their inventories over time. So I think companies will find that the more they can refine, the more they can increase traceability, the better their data will be. But along that journey, this guidance provides methods for companies to calculate those emissions. And a really critical piece is that oftentimes in CDP reporting and elsewhere, companies will mention that their emissions disclosures are aligned with the greenhouse gas protocol. And historically, again, because there wasn't very specific guidance on land-based emissions, they could have said that, and land-based emissions may still have been omitted. But now, once the guidance is released next year in the spring, that any disclosures that claim to be aligned with greenhouse gas protocol should be accounting for emissions from land use change and land management, which includes agricultural methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And so this is sort of the high level gist of what to expect. And if you go to the next slide, how this all fits together is companies will use the greenhouse gas protocol guidance to conduct their baseline inventories and also their annual inventory accounting and reporting. They can use that information to set and update their greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets. And based on all this information, companies should be, reporting, whether it be the standard sustainability reporting, also, informing their climate transition plans and really articulating based on what their emissions footprint looks like. Here are the steps that we're taking to address them in order to achieve our target that also includes land-based emissions. So overall, this will really help accelerate progress in the sector for really accounting for and addressing the land-based emissions, which remain really critical to address. And so on the next slide, you can see here, so the SBTi flag guidance is out now. It will be required for some companies starting in April 2023, and you can go to their website to get a better sense of the timeline and the expectations for companies, depending on whether they already have a target, they're just now setting a target, and all those nuances. The greenhouse gas protocol guidance is now in its draft form available and is under public consultation through November 30th. So if you would like to take a look, we definitely encourage everyone to provide any feedback in the public consultation period, and you can definitely find information on that on those respective websites. And really why companies should be looking to implement these tools is to gain better insights into the comprehensive greenhouse gas footprints in their supply chains and the hotspots for leverage points that they might have to reduce those emissions, to reduce their overall greenhouse gas inventory. They'll have standardized and comparable emissions estimates year over year. This is also really great for investors to make sure that when they're comparing more apples to apples. This will also help ensure that emissions reductions targets and actions are really encompassing the full scale of a company's footprint. And it's really important to note that companies seeking SBTi validated targets in the future, if they meet the thresholds designated by the SBTi, they will be required to set flag targets. So for most of the companies on the Food Emissions 50 list, because they have a lot of emissions from land, they will be required to set a flag target soon. And all of that information and the timelines, again, will be on the Science Based Targets Initiative's website. And so I know there are a lot of other questions on removals and other things that we didn't have a chance to get to, but we'll try to get to some of them in our follow-up. And so with that, I'll move it back to Meryl.
Thanks, Nako. I know this guidance is complex and there's a lot to dive into. So thanks for synthesizing it and giving us a quick overview. Really helpful. So as you've seen this morning, we've seen progress on disclosures and target setting. We now have better guidance to do that from SBTi and Greenhouse Gas Protocol. As Natalie mentioned, the next step is climate transition plans for companies that have comprehensive disclosures and targets. And investors are really looking for evidence that companies can achieve those targets. We don't want a repeat of 2020 deforestation targets. So over the next several months, as Nako mentioned, do look for our benchmarking of Food Emissions 50 companies on their climate transition plans and the quality of those plans. We'll be updating the benchmark with those scores in late Q1 of 2023. If you go to the next slide, we would also love to hear what you thought about today's event. So you can use this QR code to let us know. And lastly, we go to the next slide. If you are in the Boston area, please consider joining us for Evening with Series. It's going to be at the JFK Library on Monday, October 17th, so coming up quick. You can find more information on our series event page. We would love to see you there. So thank you all so much for joining. Have a great rest of your day. Again, feel free to reach out to us with any questions, and I hope you all enjoyed this webinar. Take care.